Right, let's get into that conversation with Professor Fikeni now. The Public Service Commission, in partnership with other key stakeholders, is meeting today and tomorrow in Krugersdorp, west of Johannesburg, to chart a roadmap towards the professionalisation of the public service. Now, one of the key promises in President Cyril Ramaphosa's 2022 State of the Nation address involved professionalising the public service in order to ensure improved service delivery across government spheres. Now, Ramaphosa also said that government would soon finalise a national framework on this issue. But despite government's Batho Pele Principle, South Africans continue to complain about unprofessional public servants. And this has been cited as one of the main reasons of, or causes rather, of poor service delivery in many municipalities and other public entities. Now, experts attribute this to a struggling public service sector that is not fit for purpose, and it comprises unqualified, incompetent and corrupt civil servants. So to discuss this matter further, we join now virtually, or should I say via telephone, by a chairperson of the Public Service Commission, Professor Somadoda Fikeni. Prof, good morning. Thanks so much for speaking to us here on Morning Live.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting us to share this particular matter.
I think it's common cause that South Africa is in really bad shape, Prof. And we have also seen a sharp rise in protests due to, among other things, incompetence within the civil service. But government released a policy framework in 2020 in which it actually decried the lack of professionalism in the public service and also committed to fix the problem. But what has government done so far?
Last year in October, the Cabinet, after a long process, approved the framework for professionalisation of public service. Hence, today we are meeting the Public Service Commission, members of the Presidency, Department of Planning and Monitoring, Public Service and Administration, National School of Government, assisted by the UN agency, UNDP, to map out implementation plan, because in this country we have great policies, but their execution or implementation is one of the biggest problems. And if it was successfully implemented, it would address the whole ecosystem that would enable the rebuilding of a capable, ethical, developmental state.
Now, Prof, some political experts say that, there is a problem with the framework in its current form because it is overly focused on administration, while the real problem has more to do with politics. So, in other words, it is politicians and not the bureaucrats that stand in the way of a professional civil service. What's your response to that?
I wouldn't argue with that, but I would argue with the notion that if you were to fix politicians or political leadership and the political culture, you would suddenly have a professional public service. It has to be both. It's neither one or the other. Reforms in the public service, among other things in this document, does regulate the interface between administration and politics, which was the problem we were seeing in many cases of unlawful instruction or corruption. It does address the issue of having a panel of experts to help in the recruitment of appropriately competent and appropriately qualified persons. So that is beginning to make sure that you do not have a lot of interference, but rather have fit-for-purpose people in the positions they occupy.
So if we look, Prof, at the current configuration of the public service, it, for example, does not protect the tenure of senior management. Here we're looking at directors general, DDGs, HODs. So the senior managers are changed or replaced each time a new minister is appointed in some instances. And this, as you can imagine, creates quite a bit of chaos and a lack of continuity. Has this new framework been able to address that in any significant way?
It has, because now what is envisaged is that HODs or DGs will occupy their office for a period of 10 years instead of aligning it to 5 years, which is the term when the administration or public officials or political heads are appointed, because that's where the confusion was. Each time you do have the change of an administration, you then have this pressure or push. Each time you have a cabinet reshuffle, you had this instability. This time around, it's trying to improve that tenure and security. And there are many other safeguards that are there in this particular framework.
Has the framework also been able to look at depoliticizing these positions and appointments, Professor?
Certainly, that's where now the Public Service Commission is tasked in this framework with coming up with a panel of experts who should sit in the interviews of any of the HODs or DGs in future, so that you do not have mainly the political heads who sit around the table and choose who should be coming in given the experiences that we've seen, but rather have a very strong component of professionals, of experts, some of them drawn from the professional bodies or knowledge community of practice in that particular area.
And that's a very important point, because then the next question would be, do we as the public get to know who actually sits on this panel? Because, again, if it is filled with people who are politically affiliated, then it defeats the purpose once more.
It would be sized, and it will not be the same panel. For example, if you need a DG for Department of Science and Technology or a DG for higher education and so forth, you would keep changing these, but that particular person or panel would be something of public knowledge, because these are public institutions. There should be no other thing that is hidden. The processes should be transparent.
And then, of course, Prof, you know, the elephant in the room always when it comes to issues such as these is, of course, on the one hand, the appointment of incompetent and uncaring civil servants who behave as though they are doing the public a favor by doing their jobs. And you can only imagine the corrosive effect that this has on government's ability to do its job. So that's the one question that has to be addressed. When we look at this framework, does it actually go some way towards addressing this?
It does, in line with the promotion of values and principles, because in the main, what we have been doing in the past, many assessors have indicated, has been to focus on systems rather than focusing on a values and value-based approach in which people being serviced, the mandate of the entity is at the center rather than focusing on systems, because it's quite clear some people write elegantly and write a beautiful annual report, and yet people to be serviced are miserable at the bottom. So this time around, the focus should be and will be on the impact on the very people who are being serviced. Hence, we talk of a people-centered approach. Hence, we talk of even the whole ecosystem of how people are trained in ethics, the frontline staff on how they handle the people. So it is going to be an overhaul if successfully implemented. I always underscore that, because we've had many good policies, but they die at the level of intention.
Prof, we have 30 seconds, but I have to ask you the question about the trust deficit between the public and, of course, the public service. How are we going to address that? Because to go to your earlier point, you know, we have fantastic policies, but the implementation thereof is lacking. So this framework may be fantastic, but how do we actually ensure that it does what it's supposed to do?
A clear monitoring of the process, and also an understanding that indeed the causes of trust deficit are based on a public service that had largely not delivered or that was seen as uncaring. Hence, many surveys like the one by the HSRC, the Afrobarometer, have confirmed exactly the point you're making of trust deficit, legitimacy crisis of public service and many other institutions of the public. So here the proof should be in what we begin to change so that people do not think we are theorizing about this thing or it's a PR exercise, but the programs we put in place which should begin to humanize public service.
Professor Somadoda Fikeni, Chairperson of the Public Service Commission, thank you so much for your time speaking about the professionalisation of the public service.